I never thought I'd be standing in a conference room at 67, surrounded by lawyers and witnesses about to shatter my son's world. The documents trembled slightly in my weathered hands. DNA test results that would change everything. Andrew's face across the table was a mask of annoyance and impatience. He had no idea what was coming. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. For most of my life, I was just Mark Johnson, an ordinary truck driver with calloused hands and a simple life. My story began 22 years earlier when I was 45 and my world collapsed around me. My wife Judith's funeral was on a Tuesday. The rain matched my mood, relentless and grey. We'd been married for almost 2 decades and suddenly I was alone. I remember gripping the edge of her casket, my knuckles white, wondering how I'd survive without her. We never had children of our own, not for lack of trying. The doctors had no answers, just sympathetic looks and vague medical terms that meant nothing would grow in Judith's womb. "Mark," my sister Sarah had whispered at the funeral reception, her hand warm on my arm, "I need to talk to you privately." I followed her to my kitchen, away from the murmuring guests who filled my living room with casseroles and pitying glances. "This isn't the right time," she started, eyes red-rimmed from crying. "But Tom and I are flying to Seattle tomorrow." Tom was her husband, a good man who worked in construction. "We've been asked to identify some bodies." My stomach dropped. "What bodies?" "Karen and David." Karen was Tom's sister. She and her husband David lived in Seattle with their infant son. There was an accident, highway pileup in the rain. Her voice broke. "They didn't make it." I sank into a kitchen chair. "The baby?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Andrew survived. He was in his car seat in the back, not a scratch on him." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "Mark, they named you guardian in their will. They want you to raise him." That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my empty house, a glass of whiskey in my hand, staring at a photo of Judith. "What am I supposed to do with a baby, Jude?" I asked the silence. "I drive trucks for a living. I'm gone for days at a time." 2 weeks later, I held 4-month-old Andrew in my arms as we flew back home, his tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb, and I made a silent promise. I would give this child everything. Love, stability, opportunities I never had. I would be the father he deserved. I kept that promise for 22 years. I gave up long-haul driving for local routes to be home every night. I learned to change diapers, warm bottles, and soothe nightmares. I sat through school plays where Andrew had one line, cheered at Little League games, and argued with teachers who underestimated him. "He's got a mind for numbers," I told his 4th-grade teacher at a parent-teacher conference. "He needs more challenging math." "Mr. Johnson," she'd replied, with that condescending smile teachers reserve for parents who think their children are special. "Andrew is doing fine, but he's not exceptional." I leaned forward. "With all due respect, ma'am, you're wrong. My boy is exceptional. You just haven't given him the chance to show it." That night, I started setting aside money for Andrew's college fund. $50 here, $100 there, sometimes just 20 when times were tight, but it grew, slow and steady, like Andrew himself. I never hid the truth from him. When he was 7, he asked about his real parents. "They loved you very much," I told him, showing him photos of Karen and David. "They didn't want to leave you, buddy. Sometimes terrible things happen that nobody can control. So you're not my real dad." His little face scrunched up in confusion. I pulled him onto my lap. "I'm not your biological father. That means I didn't help make you. But I am your real dad, in all the ways that matter. I love you, I take care of you, and I'll always be here for you." He seemed satisfied with that answer, snuggling against my chest before running off to play with his trucks. But as Andrew grew older, questions about his identity became more complex. In high school, Andrew excelled at math and science, just as I'd predicted. He joined the robotics team and won regional competitions. I drove him to every event, sitting in the back of auditoriums filled with parents who wore suits and carried briefcases instead of lunch pails. "Dad, I want to study engineering," he announced one night during his junior year. We were eating spaghetti at our small kitchen table, a rare steak night splurge when I'd gotten a holiday bonus. I twirled pasta around my fork. "That's a tough field, buddy." "I know, but I'm good at it. Mr. Peterson says I could get scholarships." I nodded, already calculating costs in my head. Scholarships wouldn't cover everything. "If that's what you want, we'll make it happen." And we did. I took extra shifts, sold my collection of vintage model trucks, and even remortgaged our modest house to cover what the scholarships didn't. The day Andrew received his acceptance letter to the engineering program, I think I cried harder than he did. "We did it, Dad," he shouted, waving the letter. "We actually did it." "You did it," I corrected him, pulling him into a bear hug. "I just drove the truck." College changed Andrew in ways I hadn't anticipated. He came home that first Thanksgiving with new clothes, new friends, and a subtle shift in how he looked at our small house with its worn furniture and dated kitchen. He talked about his classmates whose parents were engineers themselves, doctors, lawyers. "Jason's dad is taking him to Europe this summer," he mentioned casually as we ate turkey sandwiches the day after Thanksgiving. "That sounds nice," I said, noticing he'd barely touched his food. "Yeah, his dad's a partner at some big architecture firm in Chicago." A pause. "What was it like being a truck driver all these years?" The question caught me off guard. "Honest work," I answered finally. "Kept a roof over our heads, food on the table. Paid for that fancy school you're attending." He flushed. I didn't mean it like that, but he had. It was the beginning of a distance between us that grew wider with each passing semester. Andrew stopped bringing friends home. His visits became shorter, phone calls less frequent. When he graduated with honors, I sat alone in the audience, clapping until my hands hurt when they called his name. He got a job at a prestigious construction company in the city, making more his first year than I'd ever made in my life. I was proud, so proud it hurt sometimes, but Andrew seemed embarrassed when he had to introduce me to his colleagues. "This is my Mark," he said to his boss at a company party I'd driven 3 hours to attend. Not my dad, or even my father. Just Mark. The beginning of the end came on a Sunday in May. Andrew was 25, already climbing the corporate ladder with the determination I'd always known he had. I'd been feeling tired lately, more than usual. Strange pains in my chest and shortness of breath that I attributed to age and decades of sitting behind a wheel. "I might need to sell part of the back lot," I mentioned as we ate the roast I'd spent all morning preparing. "Doctor wants me to get some tests done. Heart stuff. Insurance doesn't cover all of it." Andrew's fork clattered against his plate. "Seriously? You're selling property now? Do you know what the market's like? It's just a small piece, son. I'm not getting any younger, and these tests, why don't you just use your savings?" He cut me off, irritation plain on his face. I stared at him. "What savings? Your education took everything I had." Something hardened in his expression. "So this is about money, again." "No, Andrew. This is about my health. I'm telling you because you expect me to pay for it. Is that it?" His voice rose. "I have my own bills, my own life. I can't keep bankrolling you because you didn't plan for retirement." The words hit like physical blows. "Bankrolling me? Son, I've never asked you for a dime. No, you just make these little comments about money and tests and selling property. It's manipulation, Dad. Classic guilt-tripping." I felt something shift inside me, a foundation cracking. "That's not fair, Andrew. I've never—" "You're not my father!" he exploded, standing so suddenly his chair fell backward. "You're not my dad! I don't have any obligation to support someone who isn't even my family." The silence that followed was absolute. I sat perfectly still, a fork halfway to my mouth, forgotten. The roast, the potatoes, the kitchen around us, everything seemed to blur except Andrew's face, flushed with anger and something that looked almost like relief, as if he'd finally said what he'd been thinking for years. Without a word, I placed my napkin beside my plate, stood up, and walked to my bedroom. Behind me, I heard Andrew call my name, his voice suddenly uncertain, but I didn't turn around. In my closet, on the top shelf behind winter blankets, was an old cardboard box. I pulled it down, carried it to the kitchen, and placed it on the table between us. "What's this?" Andrew asked, still standing, his anger replaced by wariness. "Open it," I said quietly. Inside were the documents of Andrew's life, his birth certificate, the death certificates of Karen and David, the guardianship papers I'd signed when he was 4 months old, photos of him as a baby in the hospital, his tiny hand gripping my finger, letters from Karen to her brother, mentioning how she hoped her son would grow up to be kind and generous. Andrew picked up the papers one by one, his hands shaking slightly. "I know all this," he said finally. "You've never hidden that I was adopted." "There's more," I said, pushing a sealed envelope toward him. "This came 3 days ago." He opened it slowly, unfolding the papers inside. His eyes moved across the page, widening as he read. "DNA analysis, 99.99% probability of paternity. What is this?" "I did one of those mail-in genetic tests a few months ago," I explained, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Just curious about my heritage, health risks. They found a close match in their database. You had done the same test last year, apparently." Andrew sank into his chair. This says you're my biological father. That's impossible." "I thought so too. So I had them run additional tests. Same result." I took a deep breath. "I never knew your mother was pregnant. Karen was your biological mother, but I'm your biological father." "How?" The word was barely audible. "Karen and I, it was before she met David, before I met Judith. One night, a mistake we both regretted and never spoke of again." I paused, memories flooding back. "When she and David died, and your guardianship came to me, I had no idea. Neither did anyone else. It was just a terrible coincidence, or fate, depending on how you look at it." Andrew stared at the papers, his face unreadable. All this time, I raised you thinking you were my nephew, and you were my son." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but refused to let them fall. "I gave you everything I had, not because of blood, but because of love. I would have done the same, even if these test results had never existed." He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to run to me when I came home from long hauls, arms outstretched for a hug. Then his expression closed again. "I need time to process this," he said, standing abruptly. He gathered the test results and walked out, the front door closing with a finality that echoed through the empty house. For weeks, I heard nothing. Calls went unanswered, messages unread. Then the newspaper article appeared. "Local man discovers adopted son is biological child after DNA test." Someone, not me, had leaked the story. It spread through our small community like wildfire, each retelling more dramatic than the last. I started receiving calls from reporters, neighbors, distant acquaintances. Some offered sympathy, others barely disguised curiosity. Through it all, I said nothing, did nothing, just waited for Andrew to reach out when he was ready. The request for a meeting came via certified mail. A law office downtown, neutral territory. The letter mentioned witnesses and documentation, without explaining why they were necessary. I agreed to the date and time, uncertain what Andrew was planning. Which brings me back to that conference room, lawyers on both sides of a polished table, witnesses seated along the walls. Andrew entered last, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Johnson," his lawyer began, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper consonants. "My client wishes to address the recent revelations in a formal setting." I nodded, saying nothing. My own lawyer, an old friend who'd offered his services pro bono when he heard what was happening, shifted uncomfortably beside me. Andrew cleared his throat. I've had time to consider the DNA evidence and what it means for our relationship. His voice was professional, detached, as if he were presenting at a business meeting. I want to clarify certain financial arrangements moving forward. Financial arrangements, not family connections or emotional reconciliation. Money. I've prepared a statement of my educational expenses, he continued, sliding a document across the table. Given the new circumstances, I believe these should be considered parental obligations rather than voluntary contributions. I didn't touch the paper. What exactly are you saying, Andrew? His lawyer interjected. Mr. Johnson, my client is proposing that the funds used for his education be reclassified as paternal responsibility rather than gifts from a guardian. This would nullify any implicit or explicit expectation of reciprocal support. Translation. Andrew wanted legal documentation that he owed me nothing. I felt something snap inside me, not in anger, but in profound disappointment. The room fell silent as I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. You asked if I was your father, I said directly to Andrew, ignoring his lawyer. The blood test says I am, but being a father is more than DNA. It's waking up at 2 a.m. to check for monsters under the bed. It's working double shifts to buy basketball shoes you'll outgrow in 3 months. It's teaching you to drive, helping with homework, showing up to every game and recital even when you're bone-tired. My voice remained calm, but I could feel it carrying to every corner of the suddenly still room. I did all that, not because some test told me to, but because I chose to, because I loved you before I knew you were my blood, and I loved you after. I paused, looking directly into his eyes. You shouted that I wasn't your father. But the test proves I am, and the life I gave you proves what kind of father I've been. I turned to my lawyer. I'm making some changes to my will. The house, the land, and everything I've saved will go to the Children's Hope Foundation. They help orphans find loving homes. Andrew's lawyer started to speak, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. Andrew, you asked about financial arrangements. Here they are. You owe me nothing, not money, not care in my old age, not even respect. What you give should come from love, not obligation. And if there's no love there, I shrugged, then there's nothing to discuss. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, ignoring the calls behind me. Outside, reporters had gathered. Someone had tipped them off. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but I just kept walking to my old truck, climbed in, and drove away. The story made the local papers, then national ones. Truck driver discovers adopted son is biological child after years of sacrifice. The narrative resonated with people, the working-class hero, the ungrateful son, the twist of fate that brought biological father and son together without either knowing. I was offered interviews, book deals, even a movie option, all of which I declined. Andrew's company wasn't pleased with the publicity. Clients began to question his character. A few contracts were cancelled. His carefully constructed professional image crumbled under the weight of public opinion that saw him as the villain in a modern-day parable about gratitude and family. 6 months later, a letter arrived. Andrew's handwriting on the envelope, shaky and uncertain. Inside was a single page, tear-stained and crumpled, as if it had been written and rewritten many times. Dad, it began, the first time he'd called me that in over a year. I'm sorry. Those words aren't enough, but they're all I have. I was wrong, not just about the DNA, but about everything. You were always my father, the only one who mattered. I let success and pride blind me to the most important truth in my life, that you gave me everything, and I gave back nothing but pain. The letter continued, asking for forgiveness, for a chance to rebuild what he'd destroyed. He'd resigned from his position, was seeing a therapist, volunteering at a local youth center. I'm trying to become the man you raised me to be, not the one I became when I forgot your lessons. I read the letter 7 times before folding it carefully and placing it in my wallet. Then I picked up the phone and dialed his number. Andrew Johnson, he answered, his voice professional but tentative. "It's me," I said simply, a sharp intake of breath. "Dad, I didn't think you'd call. I got your letter. I meant every word." His voice cracked. "I know I don't deserve—" "Sunday dinner," I interrupted. 6 o'clock, I'm making pot roast." There was a long pause. "I'll be there," he finally whispered. "Thank you." "Andrew," I said before hanging up, "forgiveness is free. Trust has to be earned back. It won't be easy or quick." "I know," he replied. "I'm ready to do the work." And he was. That Sunday dinner was the first of many. Awkward at first, then gradually more comfortable. Andrew found a new job, one that aligned better with his values. He stopped by regularly to help with house repairs, joined me for doctor's appointments, showed genuine interest in my life. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Andrew broke a comfortable silence. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you said that day in the conference room, about being a father being more than DNA." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "You're right. The blood connection. It's a surprise, but it doesn't change anything fundamental. You were my father when you thought we had no biological connection. The DNA just confirms what was already true in every way that matters." I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "Sometimes the universe has a strange way of bringing things full circle." "Do you think my mother, Karen, do you think she knew?" he asked. I considered this carefully. "I don't know. Maybe she suspected but wasn't certain. Maybe she wanted you to have two fathers who loved you. David, who chose you before birth, and me, who chose you after they were gone." Andrew nodded slowly. "I wish I could ask her." "Me too, son. Me too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, I realized that the truth had indeed set us both free. Not the truth of DNA, but the truth of what it means to be family. Blood may not lie, but it doesn't tell the whole story either. The real story is written in midnight fevers and first steps, in college tuition payments and shoulder rides at parades. Andrew and I rebuilt our relationship over time, stronger than before, because it was now built on truth, respect, and chosen love, rather than obligation. The DNA test that could have permanently divided us instead became the catalyst for something deeper and more authentic. And as for me, the truck driver who raised a son without knowing he was truly mine, I've learned that sometimes the most profound truths are the ones we carry in our hearts long before science confirms them. I was Andrew's father in every way that mattered for 22 years before that test result arrived. I'll be his father for however many years I have left, because that's what fathers do. We stay, we love, we forgive. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to see our children become the people we always knew they could be. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To hear our next story, just click on the box appearing on your screen. Thank you so much for listening. Your support means the world to us.